Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Netsuke Oike, as introduced, and the Deputy Chief Mission. But tonight, I'm also a model. We don't wear something like this very normally, but I have to show something to you. I wish this was my property, but in fact this is J. Hopkins. Mr. J. Hopkins owns this, and he was kind enough to lend it to me for tonight. Thank you very much for that. And I would assume that many of you have been to Disneyland. And if you have probably seen one of the most popular attractions there. It's a small world. It's a small world. And I could sing a song for you. But I don't want to drive you away before the lectures. So I'm not going to sing this time. But for the last 2 months, we've had our own small world here at the JICC. With our widely successful antique Netsuke exhibit. We have received an unprecedented level of interest from major DC media outlets. By the way, I'm supposed to mention the number of guests here, and I don't have the newest number. 3,450 people have come. So this is actually a record for any JICC exhibit so far. So our guests have stayed longer, talked more, and engaged more fully than at previous exhibits. We are very glad with these results. Many museums with beautiful Netsuke collections struggle to find the exhibit space with so many better known Japanese art objects competing. I'm so proud that the embassy staff saw this opportunity and reached out to Evergreen Museum and Dr. J. Hopkins and fan supporters to help make this wonderful exhibit possible. By the way, you will see those two people, a lady with kimono and another man with kimono. So those are the major contributors to this event. I believe we have raised the very standing of Netsuke as a Japanese art form. Our lecturers tonight will tell us more about the fascinating history of Netsuke from Japan to the far corners of the earth. I would like to express my deep gratitude to James Abbott of Evergreen Museum and Dr. J. Hopkins for the loans of their collections, and Anne-Marie Mera. We couldn't have had this exhibition without all of you. Thank you very much. Let me also mention that Rosemary Bandini came from London, all the way from London, and she will be one of the speakers tonight. And Neil Davey, our consultants in the UK, who gave us so much valuable advice and help. I understand that he's not here tonight, but we would like to express our appreciation to him. To our friends with the Freer and Sakura Gallery of Art at the Smithsonian Institute, who partnered with us and organized a joint event. Thank you very much for that. To the All Nippon Airways, Mr. Yamashita, is he here? Yeah, he's at work. But All Nippon Airways, we would appreciate for their generous assistance. To the International Netsuke Society and the DC chapter members, thank you very much. And to our organizer, the Japan American Society of Washington, for taking on the grant funding and for donating the proceeds from the catalog sale to cherry tree planting in the United States. Again, thank you very much. We are so lucky to have such partners and friends as all of you. Finally, let me thank the American citizens who were the private collectors of the 19th and 20th century Netsukes. At the time when, honestly, at the time when Japan was somewhat turning its back on traditional culture objects, they opened their hearts to Netsuke and treasured them. We very much appreciate that. Thanks to them, today we have a deep pool of preserved miniature fine art and captures the essence of Japanese culture, folklore, and aesthetics. Well, as a Japanese, sometimes we don't know much about what we had before. And for example, myself wearing this kimono, maybe I did it with Dr. J. Hopkins a while ago, but before that, perhaps 10 years ago. So working in Tokyo, this doesn't really occur to us. honestly. But you know, it's so nice to be working abroad. And in abroad, we sense our identity more clearly than in Japan itself. So tonight's exhibition is a product of many different people working together. We highly appreciate that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister Oike. Next, we will hear from Dr. J. Hopkins, one of the premier collectors of Netsuke on the East Coast and one of our partners in this exhibition.
Good evening, and I do want to share with you that you are in for a real treat tonight. We have some wonderful speakers. But before we get to that, I think it's time to celebrate this wonderful exhibition. And when big projects like this are undertaken, it takes many people to make it happen. Many too many to mention, but there's a few that deserve recognition. And you've heard from Minister Oike. He has been extremely supportive of this whole project and has helped make it happen. He has entertained in his own home a number of groups that were part of this project, and he has become interested in Netsuke himself, and so I think that has been heartwarming. Ms. Helen Van Goren, who you've heard from, is the Public Affairs Assistant, but she's that behind-the-scenes essential Girl Friday that makes everything happen, and that's the way it happened. And then finally, the exhibition coordinator, Atsushi Iwai, who was responsible for the installation. And I can tell you, looking at Netsuke exhibits in museums, conventions, all over the world, he did an extraordinary job. He's an artist in his own right. He came up with very innovative ways of presenting an exhibition, including the use of mirrors on selected pieces. These pieces are carved in the round. There is no such thing as a backside, and oftentimes the underside, the backside, is even more interesting. So he has mirrors where you can actually see this. The stands, the ability to make a tall, unstable, upright piece stable. And then finally, one of the real problems for a miniature art form when it's in an exhibition is it's really hard to see. You're looking at from a foot, 2 feet, 3 feet, where these things actually need to be held in a hand, turned. And so they have blown up pictures on the wall, and you can see the details in these amazing carvings. That's a very innovative step. So I think all of these people deserve our recognition. And then finally, the two people who made this happen, who hatched the idea. This is Miss Yoko Suge and Mr. Takaaki Nimoto. To me, Yoko and Nemo, and to many of you as well. This is an extraordinary project. They first hatched this idea some 2 years ago. I met them maybe a year and a half ago, and they came to me with this story of having seen their very first Netsuke in the storage area of an American museum, and were fascinated with the art form. To find out that it was a Japanese art form that almost nobody knew about. And they wanted to do something. They wanted to put on an exhibition and publish a catalog. And so they came and asked for some help, and I thought, oh my, yes. This is I've long since believed that this is a totally underappreciated, little-known art form that deserves better. And it's always been a mystery to me why in the country of origin it's not better known, but that's the case. So I said, yes, I'm happy to help, but I thought to myself, they've got big plans. Putting on an exhibition like this is not easy, so I wasn't completely positive that it would come about, but by golly, they hit the obstacles, the roadblocks, but to them, they were problems to be solved, which they did. And you see the result of it. They've been all over the world. They know many of the people in the Netsuke world who are far-flung and not that many. They have learned a lot about the art form. They read signatures. They know legends. It's been a real pleasure to work with them. They've come to Lynchburg several times, and their energy is unsurpassed. I mean, they commonly would spend 10 hours, which meant me, 10 hours a day, going through, looking at, studying, discussing these things. So it's been great fun. I consider them wonderful friends. It's been a pleasure to have been associated. So all I can say, Nemo, Yoko, well done. It's a great job.
Thank you, Dr. Hopkins. Tonight's program features lectures from two presenters and will be followed by a Q&A session at the end. We now welcome our first presenter to the stage. Mr. James Abbott is the Philip Franklin Wagley Director and Curator at Johns Hopkins University's Evergreen Museum and Library, and one of our partners in this exhibition. Mr. Abbott will present about the Garrett collection, a magnificent selection of masked Netsuke and more, and the history of the Garrett family as promoters of Netsuke in the West.
Can everyone hear me? You can hear me in the back, all right? Good, good. I'm actually a little embarrassed because I'm going to take this opportunity to not only celebrate this wonderful exhibition, but also to announce that Evergreen has a new book that's coming out, which you see the copy of. But I do that because Evergreen's collection of Japanese applied arts is very much a long-standing part of who we are, what we are. We are a museum of Johns Hopkins University, and we have been a part of the university since 1942. And we were actually founded by a diplomat. We were founded by John Wirt Garrett. You see him on the left. And he had a career in the American diplomatic field. He actually was instrumental in introducing the concept of celebrating arts, taking one's private collection abroad and using it as an icebreaker to encourage diplomatic discussion and negotiation. His wife, on the right, Alice Warder, grew up in Washington, D.C., not too far from here. The house now stands on 16th Street. But Mrs. Garrett was passionate about modern art. So Evergreen has a collection that she built, that she added to the house. But these two people insisted that Evergreen be a museum not of glass boxes, but it be a museum that people would walk through the door and they would feel as if they indeed were guests of the diplomatic couple. And that's very important because when we think about objects such as Netsuke and inro, these are objects that need to be touched, to be appreciated, to be seen close up. And the Garretts were very intent that the university that would receive it, Johns Hopkins University, would preserve their vision. And so that book that I spoke of is basically a book that started in 1942 and that is finally coming to fruition. And there is indeed a chapter on the Japanese collections written by my colleague, Susan Tripp. The Garretts. Why the Garretts? Who were the Garretts? Well, for those who are not familiar, the gentleman standing in the center of this photograph is John Wirt Garrett, president of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. He was second generation immigrant, rather sensitive topic today in politics, but John Wirt Garrett was probably one of the best known men of the mid-19th century because he was president and steward of America's first great railroad. And with that, he encouraged his sons to define themselves as more than just men, to actually be contributors to society, to be philanthropic in an era a little before we get into the philanthropies of the late 19th century and the early 20th century. And so the gentleman on the right is his son, Thomas T. Harrison Garrett, and on his lap is the ambassador, John Wirt Garrett, named after the grandfather. So all three generations were collectors because the grandfather believed that a man was truly going to be judged by his knowledge, so books, libraries were important, by his property, so property was acquired, and then connoisseurship. In the 19th century, it was very easy for a man or woman, but more or less probably a man, to buy a collection and call it his own. He could buy basically a carriage full of objects and decorate a room, and therefore he would see himself as a man of great taste. The Garretts were a little different. All three generations insisted that you didn't buy in bulk, you bought by quality. And so the objects that you see from Evergreen out in the gallery, just outside this theater auditorium, those are objects that were assembled one by T. Harrison Garrett and then by his son, the baby in this photograph, John Wirt Garrett. And they were truly coveted. They were studied. They were examined. Submissions were actually sent to them by dealers, full-scale drawings. There would have to be a provenance, a history. So that the Garretts were really, long before modern museum practice, they were really in tune to making sure that what they were acquiring proved what it was as described. Evergreen is the house that you see here. It was built in the 1850s. It was acquired by the Garretts in the 1870s, and it is, again, one of two museums owned and operated by Johns Hopkins University. It stands on its own 25-acre campus, and that campus is as much a museum as the galleries within. It is a fabulous 19th century arboretum that has Olmsted pedigree. It has formal gardens and natural landscape that in very many ways, the landscape having been influenced by Japanese practice, by Japanese asymmetry. Just showing you the entry hall of the house, looking into the first library. At one point, there were 10 libraries to the to Evergreen. Evergreen Museum Library has a library today of over 35,000 plus volumes, including that, remember that baby on the lap, when he was 20 years of age, his acquisition for his 20th birthday was a pristine set of John James Audubon's double elephant folio Birds of America. Now I want you to think about what you were buying when you were 20 years of age. We are a period house, so you get a sense of the collection. The Far East, the fascination with Orientalism in the 19th century very much represented that gentleman defining himself as worldly, as knowledgeable. And so bringing the arts of Japan and China and Persia and other exotic lands to Baltimore proper. Baltimore is also a fascinating magnet for the arts of Japan because of basically the B&O Railroad and the fact that it was the furthest west of the major East Coast port cities. So the trade industry was so rich, and the Garrett family actually made their fortune initially by taking materials out west as the nation was moving westward. But with the shipping, they had access to the great exotic treasures of silks and ivories, antique, and Netsuke and inro and lacquer boxes and the like. So in Baltimore, you have a concentration that you really don't have in other American cities, perhaps Boston, but it's very unique, and that's part of the reason why there is such a rich collection of Netsuke and inro at Evergreen. Some of the books that you can imagine, this is a library dedicated just to children's literature. This is a two-story library known as the Den that was built for that baby when he was about 9 years old and for his two younger brothers. The father wanted his sons to be connoisseurs at that early age. They had to keep a wish list of the top 10 objects that they wanted for their museum collections. And then at the same time, they had to start building a library. And they also had to learn how to draw. They had to draw from nature. So the bird of prey that you see between the windows is actually a drawing by one of the Garrett sons. So connoisseurship was unique with the Garretts to the level of you must draw, you must record, you must constantly evaluate what you want to collect. And Japanese art was very much a part of that passion. The print collection, if you're familiar with the Baltimore Museum of Art and the world-renowned works on paper collection that includes the Cone collection of drawings by Henri Matisse, etc., the core of that collection is the Garrett collection, which at one time was housed at Evergreen. The Riches, interiors by Herder Brothers and Louis Comfort Tiffany and the like. This is known as the Gold Bathroom, 23-karat gold cabinets and toilet seat and toilet tank and bath surround. And then the walls, floor, and ceiling are marble mosaic. And that Japanese aspect to this room is the poeticism, in that, I'm not sure if you can see it in the photograph, but there is a mottled line right around eye level. And the intent is you are standing alone in this room and you turn around and the illusion is that you're actually standing in the woods and you have just lifted your arm out of a pool of water and you've created the ripples that then descend into the horizon line. So the whole room becomes very much of this pool of water. We have wonderful, the kitchen. The utilitarian space has Sir Christopher Dresser tile installed in the 1880s. When American ceramic tile was certainly more affordable, the Garretts were importing from Minton for the servants' rooms, and I can assure you Mrs. Garrett, both Mrs. Garretts, never stepped across that threshold. Wonderful Louis Comfort Tiffany lighting fixtures that, embarrassingly enough, when Johns Hopkins University inherited the house, these were listed as ceiling fixture, $5. Lamp, a desk lamp, $2. They're worth a slightly greater sum today. But the Japanese, and here we have T. Harrison Garrett and one of his great purchases for the entry hall, which is a censer, an incense burner, sold to him as an older object, but with his curator, he hired a full-time curator in the early 1880s. There was a gentleman who actually kept track of every object, cataloged it, wrote out cards, and then also was paid to travel around the United States to study the cabinetry, the storage facilities, etc. of personal museums as well as public museums, and all of that knowledge would be brought back to Evergreen for developing storage spaces for such treasures as those miniature carvings that we celebrate outside. Here we have his bride in the center, also considered T. Harrison's greatest acquisition because she was from Old Maryland, but she is dressed in a kimono in 1879. And then you have two inro and Netsuke pieces. Keep in mind that the Garretts really were interested in sharing their collections. So as they built these collections, and most of the Netsuke and inro that are Evergreen's collection were in the house from 1885, 86, 87 to the present. That's incredible because one of the difficulties we face is I see a beautiful installation outside this theater, and I'm noticing carving and inlay and facets of these wonderful miniatures for the first time. But as the historic house, we are actually beholden to preserving the means of display selected by the Garretts. So it's quite an honor for us to lend and actually be able to rediscover the collection that we are stewards of. Here we have that wonderful inro in the shape of Mount Fuji, celebrated for its technique and also its sense of modernity and modernism and the exotic form that in itself was coveted by two generations of the philanthropic Garretts. And those wonderful masks. John Work Garrett, that baby growing up into the diplomat, in his first trips to Japan in 1892 and then in 1899, his father had died just a few years before the 1892 trip, and he was traumatized for the rest of his life because his father had died. And he knew his father had not finished building that private museum that he so wanted. And so John, as both a diplomat and as the individual scholar, he became the keeper of the flame. And almost everything that he did at Evergreen was reinforcement of what the father had envisioned. And that included the building of the Netsuke and inro collections and those hundreds, literally hundreds of miniature masks that John Work Garrett purchased in 1899 when he went off to Japan, the Philippines and Japan, to study with the medical school, the medical team. But he was so fascinated, he absorbed his father's passion. It was magnified during that trip, and then he started to add further to the collection. There are also Chinese porcelains, as you would expect, some phenomenal pieces. There are also exotic European pieces made of such things as carved rock crystal, and this is basically an imitation of a true Renaissance form piece. This was bought at a celebrity auction in the 1880s. That the Garretts were very caught up in acquiring and having more or less an encyclopedic, a global collection. Of the rooms, you have what had been a music room. Mrs. Garrett insisted her sons be certainly knowing of music. I don't think they were necessarily talented with music, but you see mother and sons in what is now the Victorian room. The landscape, 25 acres. At one point it was 50 acres. 12 glass houses, including mushroom house, orchid house. This gives you a sense of those glass houses that were eventually demolished. A friendship garden, which you see at the bottom right, which was built in the early 20th century, and it's like a Baltimore album quilt. Mrs. Garrett was, John, the ambassador's mother, was getting old, and she wanted to remember all of her friends. So just as a quilt would be assembled by your friends if you were moving away, you'd have a square from each of your devoted neighbors. Mrs. Garrett would ask them to bring plants, and she basically celebrated them in this outdoor gallery that still survives. And the landscapes, rolling hills, you see Mrs. Garrett with her 3 sons that she immediately, once they had graduated from Princeton, she sought to marry them off. And the house as it grows, a wonderful knoll, house-inspired grand stair. You have Ambassador Mrs. Garrett inherit the house in 1920, and modernism enters into it. And these wonderful Chinese scrolls, dated 1799, became the focus of a Léon Box at the Ballet Russe, a box-designed dining room created for the Garretts in 1922. And Box took an old gymnasium and converted it into a private theater. Due to 2 world wars, we have the only surviving stage sets by Léon Box of Diaghilev's Ballet Russe, as well as this wonderful theater intended to be temporary, which is over 90 years of age now. And here's more of that theater with Baltimore's first modern room. And the stage sets. And then what is truly our Far East room, where the Japanese arts are celebrated. You have a red and orange and yellow and gold interior created by Léon Box in 1924, just before his death. It had been a bowling alley, and Mrs. Garrett, Alice Warder Garrett, was already thinking about, they had no children, what was going to happen to this museum, or to this house. It would be a museum to Johns Hopkins University, and with that she started to basically segregate the collections and create galleries of different themes. And this is where the Netsuke and the inro are exhibited, along with bronzes and other lacquer pieces. I mentioned the kitchen, musical art quartet. Mrs. Garrett, Alice Warder Garrett, was a great believer in music and having artists experiment with music, fine artists. She supported the musical art quartet from 1926 to 1941. Basically, the faculty of the Juilliard came to Evergreen 6 weeks in the fall and 6 weeks in the spring to perform in her famous box theater. She would underwrite their stay. They performed 18 concerts with each season. And that fabulous Garrett library, the centerpiece being the main library that you see here, and wonderful space designed by the regional architect Lawrence Hall Fowler, who designed the War Memorial in Baltimore. And then the library collection, the riches. I spoke about John James Audubon's The Birds of America, but from Gould on, it is one of the richest of university library collections. This photograph of Toscanini, it's Ambassador Mrs. Garrett in Italy in the late 1920s. You see their art collection displayed. There's actually a drawing there by Rodin in back of Ambassador Garrett. So they would take their collection indeed on the road, and when you go to American embassies to this day and you see art collections, you see art borrowed from American museums, the seeds were planted by the Garretts. And this is the drawing room with Mrs. Garrett and a portrait by the great Ignacio Zuloaga, and Vuillards and Bonnards and Picassos, but also wonderful inro and Netsuke and lacquer pieces integrated. And I'll take you through more of the collection. Modigliani's The Handsome Major, or Handsome Dr. Deverin. And we still collect to this day. The collection, the Garretts were not stingy, and they also were not willing to give birth to a museum that would die soon after their lifetimes. Both specified in their wills that the collection must grow if the museum was to survive. And so this work by Alix Aimé, one of the few female success stories in 1920s Paris, was acquired to go with the Vuillards and the Bonnards, since Alix Aimé was also a follower of the Nabi movement. And you have the Garretts. And I'll end with this, emphasizing that Evergreen is a celebrator of collections via exhibitions. And this is a recent exhibition of the architect, Erno Fabry, a wonderful Czech-Hungarian architect who, due to World War II, in coming to the United States, he had to reinvent himself. And he was quite successful in Europe, before the war, and he came over in his 40s, and he had to redefine himself and start over where other architects in their 20s would try to surpass him. So he recreates himself, and he becomes truly an innovator with regards to the influencing American taste in a modern post-World War II era. So that is Evergreen. And where does the Japanese collection fit in? It is one of many elements that make up Evergreen. And I'm hoping that you will come to see the full collection. We're talking hundreds and hundreds of pieces, but we are honored to have loaned over 70 pieces, I believe, to this exhibition. And we are indeed appreciative of the beautiful installation and the voice that you've given to a rather rare institution in Baltimore. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Abbott. Our second lecturer tonight joins us all the way from London. Ms. Rosemary Bandini has been a supporter of this exhibition almost from the very beginning. Her expertise and advice helped to make our vision for the exhibition into reality. Ms. Bandini will present a lecture about the history of the earliest Netsuke collectors and the role of Netsuke in teaching people about the culture of Japan. The opening of Japan's borders gave rise to a huge surge of interest in Europe and the USA, which manifested itself in some surprising ways as Japan mania gripped the West.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. When I was, can you hear me first of all? When I was in senior high school, my English teacher picked a very odd book for our syllabus for the national exams. It was a book published in 1623 by John Earl called Microcosmography, a small piece of the world discovered. And although we were very happy to have this book on our syllabus because it was very small, I often think of this title of the book, Microcosmography, a piece of the world discovered, which is what Netsuke have been to us in the West. It's a little thing which helped us to discover Japan and fall in love with Japan, and hence my title. As most of you know, Japan opened up to the West mostly in the 1850s. There was a treaty between the US and Japan which was brokered by Captain Perry, who arrived there in 1853. But before that, the Dutch enjoyed a particularly privileged position of being able to trade with Japan. Everybody else, the Portuguese and the British, had all been thrown out. The Portuguese because they wanted to proselytize and turn the country Catholic, and they had imperialist ambitions towards Japan, and this was soon uncovered. But the Dutch simply wanted to trade. So they were granted the right to reside on the island of Hirado outside Nagasaki, and they sent a mission there simply for trade, but the mission always needed a doctor. So the doctor would usually be charged also with collecting flora and fauna from the country he was visiting, because hopefully he wasn't going to spend his whole time curing sick people. Philip Franz von Siebold was a German who trained in medicine, but then was invited to go and stay with some friends in Holland, and while there applied to join the military. And he was accepted, and in 1923 he went to Japan with the Dutch mission, and there he practiced as a physician. He actually was able to cure a high-ranking Japanese person of a very severe illness. And from that time on, he was rather privileged, and he was allowed to travel about. And he set up a small medical school, and indeed his daughter, he married a Japanese lady, and his daughter was the first female Japanese physician. But he also travelled a lot and picked up little bits and pieces and specimens, and everything was fine until in 1829 they discovered he'd got hold of a map of northern Japan, and this was considered an act of high treason, and he was expelled. So he arrived back in Holland in 1830 with over 600,000 items that he'd collected during his time in Japan, and amongst them there were 60 Netsuke. Some of these Netsuke we know he bought from a particular artist in Hakata. Hakata, which is now part of modern-day Fukuoka, was at the time the most important port in Japan. It was the port where Korea did its trade with Japan, so it was a very important place. While I'm up here, I mentioned that the Dutch were allowed to stay on Hirado until they built a warehouse and put the date on it, emblazoned the date on it in Roman numerals, and the emperor took umbrage to that and had the warehouse knocked down, and then sent them off to an artificial island called Decima, which was much smaller. But really, although he appeared to be punishing the Dutch for not adhering to the Japanese calendar, in fact what he wanted to do was reduce the power of the particular clan who were profiting so greatly from the Dutch mission. So we know, because they still exist, that he bought Netsuke from Matsushita Ottoman, who lived in Hikata. And those pieces are now in the museum in Leiden, which used to be von Siebold's house in Holland. And now I have to go back because I forgot to tell you that this boar is from the von Siebold collection, but it's in a museum in Munich. He gave some Netsuke to Munich and he gave some Netsuke to Leiden. So this tiger on the right-hand side is a very typical Ottoman tiger. And there were no tigers in Japan, so how did Ottoman see it? Where did he get his imagery from? Well, because they traded with Korea, Ottoman would actually have seen tiger skins coming into Japan, so he would have been familiar with the code markings. In fact, the first tiger that was ever mentioned in Japanese literature was mentioned in 1720 in the Nihon Shoki, and in 840, in 720, and 840, a live tiger was brought to Japan, but of course it didn't survive. And Hideyoshi himself, after the Korean expedition, came back with a live tiger, which he fed dogs to. And because the tiger needed a lot of dogs, he had a man go around and collect dogs to feed to the tiger, until eventually the man came with what must have been an Akita, I suppose, because they both fought to the death. Both animals were killed in this final thing. And I think that the dog was chosen to kill the tiger because everybody was fed up of their dogs being taken to feed it. The interesting thing with the pieces which are in Leiden actually is that they're not marvellous Netsuke, they're actually odd little bits. And the Netsuke on the left-hand side is actually in the British Museum. It's of a daikon, and this is probably more the kind of thing that would have interested von Siebold. It was a specimen, a Japanese specimen of a vegetable that was eaten. But the interesting thing here is that it's carved of a tiger's tooth. So the material was still coming to Japan with the tiger skins. There were also tiger's teeth. In the UK, we have the British Museum, and we've been talking about early collectors. In the 18th century, collecting was really only for aristocrats, for landed gentry, people with money. They would collect study pieces, be it natural history examples, pieces of classical art, manuscripts. These were the sort of things that they collected, and they would have little salons in their home, and they would put up little exhibitions of their collections and impress their friends and their peers with what they had. In 1753, Sir Hans Sohn, who had a big collection of natural history examples and manuscripts, gave it to the state as wanting to establish a museum with it. In return for £20,000, he wanted his whole collection to be exhibited as the British Museum, and that's how it was founded. But it was only open to people of the very highest class. You had to make an appointment to go, and you would be shown around by one of the curators who really had no time to show people around, so they could occasionally be disturbed to take a group around, but they were really only interested in studying. In 1810, the rules were relaxed, and they opened the doors to anybody of decent appearance. In 1822, the Prime Minister, Robert Peel, the same one who introduced the police force, the bobbies, to England, decided or decreed that art and study and culture were of benefit to every man, to all sections of society. So from 1822, the museum was open to the general public. And this was a significant thing, because at that time, there were people making fortunes with industry. Just as here they were making their fortunes with railroads and banking. In the UK, people were mining coal, making steel, building engines. And they wanted money. They wanted to be part of this world which had sophistication and study. And the British Museum opened the doors to them to give them a chance to collect. Now, Franks, I consider the real founder of the British Museum as we know it today. He was from an aristocratic family, he never married, and he joined as a junior employee of the museum, and the keeper of the museum, Antonio Panizzi, absolutely hated him. Panizzi only wanted to have classical art and manuscripts. That's what the museum was, and that's all he wanted. And Franks kept trying to bring in decorative arts. He kept trying to bring in British art, and he was relegated every time to lower and lower ranks, smaller and smaller offices, until finally he was given permission to be the keeper of the British art and to bring British art, decorative arts, into the museum. But Franks didn't stop there. He travelled the world. He went to Japan, he went to China, he went to Italy, he went everywhere. And he went to Regent Street, where there were lots of dealers selling Japanese and Chinese things, and he bought a massive amount of Netsuke. I've seen the invoices, they're still in the museum. They're long sheets with maybe 30 pieces on one sheet that he's bought, and he had them as his personal collection, but because he was a bachelor, he didn't have a permanent home, he rented, and he left them at the museum. And eventually they were bequeathed to the museum. He built 27 new departments in the museum. He made the museum what it is today. And nowadays, I'm very glad to say that Nicole Romanier is making a rotating exhibition of Franks's Netsuke. She's putting out about 30 or 40 at a time in a cabinet, so they can be seen, because for so many years they were kept in the dark. Franks commented that collecting was a disease for which he was afraid there was no cure. Meanwhile, in France, there were, of course, if you have collectors, you also have dealers. In France, there were two brothers called the Sichel, who were probably the first dealers to have a significant gallery offering Japanese art. And the interesting thing about Sichel is they offered a slightly different perspective to what was happening at that time. Everybody, 1870 onwards, was a very big time for collecting Japanese art. But the Sichels were the dealers, and Philippe Sichel wrote a memoir published in 1884, I believe, no, 1874, called Notes d'un bibliothèque au Japon, which more or less translates as notes from a collector of decorative items in Japan. And you'll see here they've taken a print by Hokusai, one of the 100 Views of Mount Fuji, published in 1830, and they've turned it into an advertisement saying that it's ready to fill in with a date of that they've just received a new shipment from Japan, and they're inviting their clients to come in and inspect it. There's porcelains, bronzes, ivories, fabrics, lacquer, enamels and cloisonné, and objects of art. They were publicising it. The interesting thing about this book, which Sichel wrote, is that he thought he was stealing Japan's culture from it, that they had no interest at all in their culture. He was coming back with these wonderful prizes, these that he was putting in packing crates and sending back, and he couldn't understand how the Japanese could be so dismissive of their art. what he didn't understand, he was really rather an arrogant man, he didn't understand that Japan had, as has already been mentioned, they moved on. They were embracing the Western world, they were embracing science from the West and modernizing themselves, while as Europe was turning back on itself. Europe was a world where the aristocratic classes, who'd been used to being in charge, looked at Japan and they saw a society which was ordered, polite. It seemed to have a complete order where everybody knew his place and nobody was going to try to jump up and be above himself. And this is what European upper classes craved for. They craved for a return to the old days. They saw a nobility in Japan that they wanted to capture, to go back to, and it's reflected in all art forms at that time. And I think it was the same feeling in France as well. And one of the clients of Seychelles, of course, was, as you probably everybody in this room has read The Hare with Amber Eyes, and Seychelles was the client who supplied Charles Ephrussi with his 264 Netsuke and a black lacquer cabinet. And you probably also know this painting by Renoir showing Ephrussi in his top hat at the back, mingling with the people. The thing about Ephrussi is he had this cabinet of Netsuke, and it has spawned a great deal of interest throughout the world in Japan, for which I'm very grateful. But he bought it as one lot. Did he add to it? Or did he just keep it as a box of curiosities for his visitors to admire, and eventually it finished up in a dressing room, I believe? I don't think he was a collector. He was a collector of paintings, of impressionist paintings, certainly, and he was a sophisticated man. But for his Netsuke, he was somebody who had bought a ready-made collection, and that doesn't make him a collector, that makes him not even an accumulator. It just makes him a buyer of a thing. In 1872, the term Japonisme was coined, and if any of you have been to I'm sure most of you have, been to see the Utamaro exhibition on at the Sacre Gallery at the moment, this is a very, very nice illustration of how Japanese art was absorbed into the Western aesthetic and changed. But I found this photograph rather interesting because there's the Le Paris Illustré du Japon from 1846 with a tracing over it, and then the following year a painting by Van Gogh. We all call him something different, Van Gogh, Goffu, Van Gogh, whatever you want to call him, on the other side, which is obviously a direct tracing copy of that portrait by Asen. Meanwhile, in London, Liberty's had opened its doors in 1874. A department store which specialised in importing things from China and Japan, fabrics and decorative objects, and it offered something which hadn't been seen before. It was a chance for women to go shopping in a safe atmosphere by themselves and choose what they wanted themselves. It wasn't the man going out to shop, women could go to Liberty's and shop and choose things. So it changed the dynamic of society in that way. But this rather dreadful thing, in 1885, the Japanese native village was opened by somebody called Tanaka Buhikro-san. His mother was Japanese, his father Dutch, and I can only think that Tanaka was a corruption of the name Tanaka. Anyway, his idea was to get people over from Japan and to get them to build a village in the traditional Japanese way, and then practice their crafts while people came to look at them. They had to live a normal Japanese life right next to Albert Gate in Hyde Park, and they had to go about their daily pursuits as a sort of show. Tokyo was very alarmed by this, as they felt it didn't reflect Japan's greatness respectfully. But anyway, it was a huge success, and despite burning down once, it was rebuilt, and it didn't close until 1887, so it was on for almost 2 years and had over 1 million visitors. And it was also used as an inspiration for the staging of the operetta Madame Butterfly, which of course, I believe it's on now, isn't it? Yes. In Washington. Again, Japan was not very happy. Tokyo felt this wasn't a nice reflection of Japan, but in fact what it was a political satire about the British government of the day. It wasn't aimed at Japan at all. And this is an interior scene showing Japanese craftsmen at work, being closely observed by the Victorian visitors. It's a curious concept that I think they tried to do it in France, but it didn't work quite so well. In the meantime, of course, you're getting the great exhibitions coming to Europe, and the first great exhibition that Japan took part in, I think they were obliged to show their things in the Chinese pavilion, but they soon had their own displays, and people were incredibly impressed by the quality and skill of what was coming from Japan. So they were all interested, the general public, the Victorian Britain with their heavy furniture and their heavy clothes and their queen in mourning, always dressed in black and not very often in public, were delighted by the colour and the lightness of Japanese art. And in Netsuke they had this little microcosm of Japanese life which they could look at and be thrilled by and read stories about and create a little world for themselves of what they imagined Japan was. In Japan, William Sturgis Bigelow was one of your great collectors. In America, William Sturgis Bigelow was one of your great collectors. He was the son of a renowned surgeon, and he himself studied medicine, and he went to Europe for 5 years where he studied with Louis Pasteur. But in 1882 he travelled to Japan in the company of Fenollosa and Sylvester Morse, both of whom would go on to become curators of the MFA in Boston. Bigelow loved it so much that he stayed for 7 years and studied the ways of Buddhism. So here he is on one side in his American clothes, but on the other side how he lived in Japan. He really fell in love with Japan. And when he died eventually, he insisted that half of his ashes were to be scattered at the Midera in Kyoto and half at his family's tomb in Mount Auburn. He left a huge collection to the MFA in Boston, and they have a very rich heritage of works of art. The only picture I could find was of this rat in the centre by Masakazu, which was from his bequest. New England did pretty well. E.G. Stillman was also the son of a very rich man who made his money in railroads and banking, as seems to have been the way then. And he travelled to Japan in 1905 before he started at Harvard and became enamoured of Japan straight away. He collected a lot of mask Netsuke actually, which he donated to Harvard Theatre Museum. And the rest of his Netsuke he dispersed amongst various New England museums. This one he gave to the Peabody Essex in Salem, Massachusetts. It's a curious piece actually. It's signed Toyamasa, and Jay will agree with me. Toyamasa is typically a carver who would carve in wood. So it puzzles Netsuke experts, this piece. Is it really Toyamasa? It certainly looks like a Toyamasa. And in New York, in 1895, Yamanaka Company. Yamanaka was an Osaka company, and Yamanaka Sadajiro opened the company in New York in 1895, and it enjoyed such success that he opened another branch in 1900 in Boston and another in London. His clients were mostly ladies, like I said, with Liberties. This was a place where ladies could go to shop, and he was well aware of it. And he took great care to cater to their needs, and even employed foreign workers to create things that looked Japanese for his shop to please his clientele. As long as it looked Japanese, it was all right. And just to show you, in 1913, Royal Worcester in England came out with a whole group of ceramic Netsuke. This one at the top on the right, illustrated in black, is a ceramic Netsuke by Royal Worcester. Beneath it is an ivory Netsuke by Masanao of Kyoto. And looking at the head of the Royal Worcester example, it looks like it's taken from a Massenau piece. But they did a whole series of these in 1913, and the black one and the ivory coloured ones are all right, but they also come in blue and pink and green and I don't know what kind of colour. I've always been curious and wanted to buy one of these, but I won't pay more than £200, and I can't get one for under £200, so I haven't got one. And on the left-hand side, a jasper snake by Carl Fabergé. Fabergé had a Netsuke collection. We know this. And on a recent visit to the Hermitage, I was told that his Netsuke are still in the Hermitage, and they're all mixed up with those of Maxim Gorky, so they don't know which ones belong to whom. But Fabergé, as we know, carved these little hardstone animals, which were avidly collected by the aristocracy, and particularly the British royal family, and this jasper snake is in the collection of Her Majesty the Queen. And beneath it, there's a lovely Nagoya School snake in wood, a Netsuke, which I have to say is rather more convincing than Fabergé's, but nonetheless, people were copying Netsuke at the turn of the century. In Paris, there was a dramatist and libretto writer called Philippe Dennery, who married a lady called Clémence, whose family were collectors. They built themselves a magnificent house on the Avenue Foch. And she came already with a passion for collecting things from China and Japan. And the house was built in 1875, and by 1890 it was stuffed to the gills with over 6,000 objects of art. Now she had the most celebrated cabinet maker of the day come in and create these cabinets for her to display the Netsuke, and this is how they're still displayed. The house eventually was given to the Guillemot Museum, who have kept it as it was, with all these cabinets full of Netsuke. But Clémence was an accumulator. She didn't go out and choose Netsuke, she used to send her man out to the Bon Marché. Bon Marché was the first ever department store in the world, and they used to ring up when they got a new arrival from Japan, and her man would go and watch the crates being opened and literally buy them by the handful and take them home. The result of which means there are some masterpieces in there, but 70% or 80% of it is of no merit whatsoever. Nonetheless, and Hélène Bayou of the Guillemot Museum says of the collection, it's a collection of curiosities and phantasmagoria. She wasn't a collector, she was an accumulator of art. They weren't collected in a way that we collectors today would consider collecting them. They weren't, unlike the Evergreen House Netsuke, they weren't chosen one by one with love and care, they were just bought. But the Ennery is a fascinating museum to visit if you can get in, which is another story. It is open to the public, but it's very tricky to get entry. A name you'll all know, John Pierpont Morgan, Senior. Again, the son of a railroad man and a banker. He was a sickly child, and his parents used to take him round to visit museums a lot, and he grew to have a very keen interest in art. As a man, he became so powerful that it was said that the people on Wall Street would step to one side and part the ways for him to walk through, because he was such an important character. And his art collection that he formed was said to rival that of a king. And amongst the things he collected, of course, there were Japanese items. And this inro and Kagami Buto Netsuke eventually fell into the collection of another Wall Street collector, Charles A. Greenfield. Unlike Pierpont Morgan, Greenfield didn't like to be recognised. He had no wish for publicity. He was a very modest man personally, though he had a very lively social life. He didn't want to have that kind of profile. And this rather blurry picture I'm showing you because this is how Charlie kept his inro and Netsuke. I don't know if you can see from the blown up picture. His cabinets were designed for him by his best friend Leonard Haber of Magnavox. And you can see all the inro pinned up in rows, and beneath them there are little shelves with all the Netsuke lined up against them. And you could take them out of their cabinets and look at them, but Charlie always insisted that you wore white gloves so that you didn't damage his works of art. There was in the 1930s, I suppose, he bought his first Netsuke in 1930, and after he bought that, he bought a few more, and then he decided he wanted to study, so he read every book there was, accumulated every book there was, and then he began to collect in earnest. He had another piece in his collection which used to belong to Ephraim Zimbalist, the violinist, and then in the 1960s he bought the entire collection of Damari and Dorothy Bess. Damari Bess was a very famous war reporter and the editor of the Saturday Evening Post. So obviously they were collectors too, because Charlie bought their whole collection. Charlie, you could say, was at the forefront of the second wave of collecting. The first wave of collecting abated around the time of the Great War, 1914, 1918. A lot of collectors had got old, the 19th century collectors had got old, their collections mostly went to auction, and at that time, I suppose Americans were buying from London auctions to what people in London could no longer really afford to collect. The world had changed, the country was poor after a war, so a lot of the great collections came over here, and in Paris a lot of collections were sold there as well. There was another collector in England called William Winkworth, who was a descendant of the William Wilberforce, who led the movement to emancipate slaves in the UK and to end the slave trade. And Winkworth was of a very good family, clearly, but he wasn't very rich, so he took a post at the British Museum, where after much agonising he was told that he was allowed to earn a salary, because there had been a precedent where a gentleman had earned a salary, because otherwise they weren't supposed to. He was totally in love with Japan, and this period between the war and the next great wave of collecting, there were a few collectors who really were in love with Japan, who weren't going to let that moment pass, and they took advantage of it to buy great pieces for more affordable prices. But Winkworth complained that his colleagues they moved on to China as their main focus of interest, and they totally disdained him for his love of Japanese decorative arts. And he reported that they treated him, that socially he could go anywhere he wanted, even though he had no money, he was their equal socially, but when it came to intellectually, they were great snobs, and he was despised as if he were a communist for his love of Japanese art. You can't talk about American collectors without mentioning the name of Ray Bushell. Ray went to Japan in 1948 as a lawyer, as part of that large influx of of Americans to Japan who were helping to rebuild the country and get it back on its feet again. And Ray, as another Westerner who went to Japan and fell in love with Japan, and he very quickly became enamored of Netsuke, and he became a collector and a dealer. And he could be ruthless. He didn't always earn himself friends, and particularly in Japan he didn't earn himself friends. But the reason we all remember Ray is that he wrote the two books which are in every Netsuke collector's library, Collector's Netsuke and Netsuke Familiar and Unfamiliar, are staples of every Netsuke collector's library. And Ray's collection, he left a large section of his collection to the LA County Museum, who have a large permanent exhibition of his Netsuke, which rotates every couple of years. And if you want to see a great Netsuke display, that's somewhere to visit. This crane by Kai Gyokusai was his holy grail. He always wanted it. He eventually bought it from a Kyoto dealer called Imai, and it is always known as the Imai crane. Like so many Americans, Bushell went to America to work. and then fell in love with something while he was there. Another American who went to Japan with the Air Force as a physician, a medical officer, and became fascinated with these little carvings is Dr. J. Hopkins. The thing with J, he was clever. He didn't just pick up the little souvenir carvings, which Japan was happily producing to sell to these stupid Westerners who wanted these Netsuke. J understood quickly what was a good Netsuke, and he studied them, and he started on a lifetime's passion where he managed to collect a great collection. Through hard work and study and passion, he how many years have you collected them for, Jay? 1970? 40 years. 40 years of collecting. Collectors now include the occasional aristocrat, several CEOs, but also teachers, nurses, and even an oil rig worker. One group has always been particularly active, and this was noted as far back as the 1870s. A lot of these men were medical men, dentists and medical men. And what is it that attracted them so much to Netsuke? Well, it must have been studying things through microscopes, looking, understanding and appreciating the anatomical accuracy of carvings. It's always been a very large group of collectors and still is today. Edmund de Waal was asked by his neighbour whether or not his Netsuke should have stayed in Japan, really, and his answer was, no, not at all. Netsuke have always been, works of art have always been bought and sold and bartered and lost and stolen and given as gifts, and the important thing about art is the way you tell its story. Marvellous exhibitions like this one give us an unparalleled chance to glimpse into that world and learn about the culture of Japan. Museums often fail to show their Netsuke. There are many museums in the world that have great Netsuke collections that are never put out on display because they're considered small decorative arts, not of importance, and museums sometimes fail in their duty to teach. But as I was just having this conversation earlier, they fail in their duty to cater to the people who visit them. They put out the things which are great and which are important and which reflect well on them intellectually, but there is still this element of snobbery and disdain towards decorative arts. But the fact is, when the British Museum put out the first Frank's Netsuke exhibition 2 or 3 years ago, they were overwhelmed with the number of visitors, and they said it was the biggest audience they'd ever had. Also in the embassy in Japan we had an exhibition, a loan exhibition like this one in 2013. It was the most successful exhibition the JICC in London has ever had. There is a great passion for Netsuke. They're crowd pullers. They truly offer this glimpse into Japan and your understanding of it. It's a magical thing to hold another world in the palm of your hand, and an even more magical thing to take it home in your pocket. Oh, thank you.